Welcome to Lesson 30.3, Human Body Systems, Part 2. In this lesson, we'll identify the structures and functions of the nervous system, skeletal system, integumentary system, and male and female reproductive systems. The nervous system is our window on the world. The nervous system collects information about the internal and external environment, processes that information, and responds to it. All these messages are carried by electrical signals called impulses through nerve cells called neurons. The neurons and supporting cells that form the peripheral nervous system collect information about the body's external and internal environment. The brain and spinal cord form the central nervous system, which processes and creates a response to that information, which is then carried to muscles, glands, and other tissues by the peripheral nervous system. The billions of messages sent through the body at any given moment may tell us to laugh at a joke or tell us that it's cold outside. These messages enable the organs of the body to act together and also to react to external conditions. Neurons can be classified into three types. Sensory neurons carry impulses from sense organs, such as eyes and ears, to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carry impulses from the central nervous system to muscles and glands. Interneurons process information from sensory neurons and send commands to other interneurons or motor neurons. All neurons have certain features in common. These include a cell body, dendrites, an axon, and in many neurons, a myelin sheath. Neurons carry information by using specialized proteins in their cell membranes to create small electrical currents. Neurons at rest have an electrical charge, 70 millivolts, called the resting potential, between the inside and outside of their cell membranes. This charge is produced by membrane proteins that pump sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into it. Separate potassium channel proteins make it easier for potassium ions than sodium ions to diffuse back across the membrane. Because the pumps create a higher concentration of potassium ions inside the cell, positively charged ions diffuse out of the cell. The inside of the cell becomes negatively charged compared to the outside. This is a neuron at rest. The resting potential in this cell is maintained by membrane proteins that pump sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into it. When a neuron receives a large enough stimulus, this resting potential changes suddenly, producing a nerve impulse called an action potential. The smallest stimulus that can produce an action potential is called a threshold stimulus. Stimuli weaker than the threshold will not produce an action potential. Nerve impulses are not created by a flow of electrons down the axon. Instead, each axon potential is produced by a sudden reversal of the resting potential. At the leading edge of the impulse, gated sodium channels open. Sodium ions flow into the cell, reversing the potential between the cell membrane and its surroundings. This rapidly moving reversal of charge is called an action potential. As the action potential passes, gated potassium channels open, allowing potassium ions to flow out and restoring the resting potential inside the axon. This charge reversal travels down the axon like ripples passing down the surface of a stream. The central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, is contained almost entirely inside the bony structures of the skull and vertebral column. Most information process occurs in the major brain regions, cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. Different parts of the brain perform different functions. Sensations from various body areas are felt by specific brain regions. Commands to muscles originate in other brain areas. The spinal cord, which contains most of the neurons that enter and leave the brain, links the brain to the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system contains nerves and associated cells that are not part of the brain or spinal cord, and it has two major divisions, sensory and motor. The sensory division consists of receptor cells, which gather information, and sensory neurons, which transmit impulses from sense organs to the central nervous system. The motor division transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the muscles and glands. These messages are relayed through networks called the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system regulates activities such as movement of skeletal muscles. Some somatic nervous system actions are under voluntary control. When you lift your finger or wiggle your toes, impulses originating in the brain are carried through the spinal cord to motor neurons, which stimulate muscles. Other somatic nervous system actions occur automatically. If you step on a tack with your bare foot, your leg may recoil before you're aware of the pain. This rapid response, a reflex, is produced by impulses that travel through a pathway known as a reflex arc. Information about the injury is also sent to the brain, even though your leg and foot have already moved. The autonomic nervous system regulates activities that are not under conscious control. For instance, when you start to run, the autonomic nervous system speeds up your heart rate and blood flow to skeletal muscles, stimulates sweat glands, and slows down contractions of smooth muscles in the digestive system. The autonomic nervous system consists of two equally important parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which usually have opposite effects. For example, the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate and the parasympathetic nervous system decreases it. This enables precise control of body systems in the same way that using both the gas pedal and the brake enables a driver to control the speed of a car. In general, the sympathetic system prepares the body for intense activity, the fight or flight reaction. The parasympathetic system produces the rest and digest response. The skeletal system supports and shapes the body like an internal wooden frame supports a house. The skeleton supports the body, protects internal organs, assists movements, stores minerals, and is a site of blood cell formation. Bones also act as rigid rods on which muscles exert force to produce movement. In addition, bones contain reserves of minerals such as calcium salts. The 206 bones in the adult human skeleton form the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton, the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage, supports the body's central axis. The bones of the arms, legs, pelvis, and shoulders area make up the appendicular skeleton. Bones are living tissue made up of a solid network of living cells and protein fibers surrounded by deposits of calcium salts. Bones are surrounded by tough connective tissue called periosteum. Beneath the periosteum is a thick layer of compact bone. Nerves and blood vessels run through compact bone in channels called Haversian canals. Osteoclasts and osteoblasts line the canals. A less dense tissue, known as spongy bone, may be found under the compact bone, especially in the ends of long bones. Despite its name, spongy bone is quite strong. The tiny structures of spongy bone are arranged in such a way that they cannot support a lot of force. Red bone marrow is found in the spaces of spongy bone. Near the ends of bones where force is applied, spongy bones form latticework structures that resemble supporting girders in a bridge. These structures add strength without excess mass. Inside many bones are cavities containing one of two types of bone marrow. Yellow marrow consists primarily of cells that store fat. Red marrow contains stem cells that produce most of blood cells. Growth plates contain dividing cartilage cells that increase the size of a bone until a person reaches his or her adult life. A place where one or more bones meet is called a joint. Joints contain connective tissue that hold bones together and permits bones to move without damaging one another. Joints can be classified as immovable, slightly movable, or freely movable. Immovable joints, often called fixed joints, allow no movement. The bones at an immovable joint are interlocked and grow together until they're fused. Most bones in the skull meet at immovable joints. Slightly movable joints permit a small amount of movement. Unlike the bones of immovable joints, the bones of slightly movable joints are separated from each other. The joints between the two bones of the lower leg and the joints between the vertebrae are examples of slightly movable joints. Freely movable joints, like the shoulder joint, permit movement in two or more directions. Freely movable joints are grouped according to the shapes of the surfaces of the adjacent bones. The ball and socket joints allow for movement in many directions. They are the most freely movable joints. The pivot joint allows one bone to rotate or turn around another. Pivot joints allow you to turn your arm at your elbow and shake your head to say no. Saddle joints allow one bone to slide in two directions. Saddle joints allow a thumb to move across a palm. Hinge joints permit back and forth motion, like the opening and closing of a door. Muscles generate the force needed to power movement, from a leap in the air to the hint of a smile. There are three different types of muscle tissue that are specialized for different functions: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscles are usually attached to bones. They are responsible for voluntary movements. When viewed under a microscope at high magnification, skeletal muscles appear to have alternating light and dark bands called striations. For this reason, skeletal muscle is said to be striated. Most skeletal muscle movements are consciously controlled by the central nervous system. Skeletal muscle cells are large, have many nuclei, and vary in length. Because skeletal muscle cells are long and slender, they are often called muscle fibers. Smooth muscle cells are so named because they don't have striations and therefore look smooth under the microscope. These cells are spindle-shaped and usually have a single nucleus. Smooth muscle movements are usually involuntary. They are found throughout the body and form part of the walls of hollow structures such as the stomach, blood vessels, and intestines. Most smooth muscle cells can function without direct stimulation by the nervous system. Cardiac muscle is found in just one place in the body, the heart. Cardiac muscle is striated like skeletal muscle, although its cells are smaller and usually just have one or two nuclei. Cardiac muscle is similar to smooth muscle because it is not under the direct control of the central nervous system. Muscles produce movement by shortening or contracting from end to end. Muscle contraction produces force only by contracting, but muscles are organized into groups and pairs that work against each other around joints. Skeletal muscle fibers contain units called sarcomeres, which contain filaments composed of the proteins myosin and actin. Interactions between myosin and actin make it possible for muscles to generate force. Together, myosin and actin form tiny force-producing engines. During a muscle contraction, myosin filaments form cross bridges with actin filaments. The cross bridges then change shape, pulling the actin filaments towards the center of the sarcomere. This action decreases the distance between the ends of the sarcomeres, so the fiber shortens. Then the cross bridge detaches from actin and repeats the cycle by binding to another site on the actin filament. This is called the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. When a muscle is relaxed, myosin and actin filaments are not attached. During contraction, myosin attaches to binding sites on actin, forming cross bridges. Using ATP, the cross bridges pull the actin towards the center of the sarcomere. Cross bridges break, myosin binds to another site, and the cycle begins again until the muscle fiber is contracted.